All right, wonderful. Well, so thank you all for being here. My name is Ben Levin. I'm a professor here at CU, teach criminal law and criminal procedure, and feel incredibly fortunate to be a part of this conference, to be a part of this panel. I'm gonna start out, gonna introduce our panelists. Each of them is gonna speak for a few minutes about some of their work. Again, each of them could easily speak for the full 90 minutes about all the incredible things that they're doing, but we won't let them. So we'll do that. We're gonna have a conversation sort of among the panelists. I have some questions for them. I'm sure they have questions for one another. And then we'll open things up to the room and to the virtual room. Just a couple of quick thank yous before we begin. First of all, thank you to Suzette for all she's done for this, for inviting me to be a part of it. And thank you to Yesenia, to Lindley, to all the terrific staff who are making this possible. It's a lot of work and they've done really great stuff. And also to my terrific student, April Fortner, wherever she is. Hey, April. Who has done terrific stuff in bringing this panel together. The panel would not exist were it not for April. So I am incredibly fortunate to be joined by these wonderful panelists, all of whom are people whose work I've read or taught or been inspired by, and I hope that you all will be as well today. So we'll just travel down the panel, starting to my left, with Jack Chin. So Jack Chin is the Edward L. Barrett Jr. Chair and Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law. He writes about criminal procedure, immigration, and Asian Pacific American legal history. And I should note at the outset, and this does not just apply to Jack, that I'm just gonna be brief in terms of the bios. I invite you all to read more about each of the panelists and the program. Again, those bios do not begin to do them justice, and I know that these will not. So moving on from Jack, we have Robert Saleem Holbrook. Robert Saleem Holbrook is the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center, a law project dedicated to ending race and class-based discrimination in the criminal justice system and all forms of state violence. Moving on, we have Sunita Patel. Sunita Patel is an assistant professor of law and the founding faculty director of the UCLA Veterans Legal Clinic. Current scholarship examines how policing embeds itself in healthcare and other areas of care work. More generally, her research and teaching interests lie in police litigation, social movements, and structural inequality. And finally, we have Monica Bell. Monica Bell is a professor of law at Yale Law School and an associate professor of sociology at Yale University. Her areas of expertise include criminal justice, welfare law, housing, race in the law, qualitative research methods, and law and sociology. So again, so fortunate to be joined by these panelists, and we will move down the row, beginning with Jack. Everyone's gonna speak for a few minutes, just begin to introduce some of their work. So take it away, Jack.
Thank you. I want to thank Dean Buckner-Innes and Professor Malveaux, Professor Levin. It's really... Can you hear me now? Okay. So this panel is on the connections between race and the criminal justice system. And I see many, including some of the ones that Professor Higginbotham alluded to before. And people have written about these connections in the broad sense. We have the presumption of being enslaved, the presumption of freedom based on race. It's embodied in law in things like the Fugitive Slave Act and past laws, which put African-American people in the position of being scooped up at any time and sent into slavery. And that has been compared to the situation of Chinese Americans under the Chinese Exclusion Act, who were presumptively foreign and also could be arrested at any time. And if they were not carrying their registration, they were the only ones required to register. The borders were open at this time, but they had to register and they had to carry ID. And if they couldn't convince the authorities that they were lawfully present in the United States, they could be deported to China. And we move forward to contemporary things like the Arizona Show Me Your Papers law, SB 1070, and stop and frisk. So there are these broad connections, and we can say that only white people have a deeply entrenched tradition of being able to move freely without the risk of police interference. But I also think there are certain tighter and more concrete connections. And what I'm talking about are various cases And I really wish that I could assign these to you. I'm giving you the citations because I think they're important. And these are cases where I see slave law becoming race law and race law becoming enforcement discretion. United States versus Dow is an 1840 decision that had to do with the testimonial capacity of non-whites to testify against whites. This is a slave law problem. This opinion was written by Chief Justice Taney on circuit, so he was a single judge acting as a trial judge. And you all understand, I hope, the importance of being able to testify against somebody or not. If you can't testify against them because, say, you are a woman and your accusation of rape has to be corroborated by independent evidence, and if it's not, you can't testify, or if you're an enslaved person and you can't testify, then you're subject to all kinds of criminal victimization with no recourse. So Dow involved a Filipino sailor, Malay in the racial categorization of the time. This is 17 years before Dred Scott, and Lorenzo Dow, the sailor, wanted to be treated as white for purposes of the testimonial capacity laws. And Chief Justice Taney said, no, you're not white. Why? Well, the traditional anthropology that we heard about earlier, the categorizations of the scientific racists. Second reason Chief Justice Taney gave was that if you look back at the history of the founding of the United States, the colonists only wanted and expected immigration from the white Christian nations of Europe, which were the only civilized nations at the time. The third reason is that in his investigation of the legal history of Maryland and the world, Malays were enslavable, not Indian, not African, but they were enslavable under the tradition, and thus they might have the same resentments against white people that other enslavable people had, and so the policy for not treating them as white existed. Whites, Taney said, were the race of which the masters were composed, the master race, and Malays were not part of it. So I see Dow as a case where Chief Justice Taney, 17 years before Dred Scott, easily accommodates Asians who do not have an extensive tradition of slavery in this country, as I understand it, into the slave law structure. The next case is State versus Jowers, the North Carolina Supreme Court, 1850. And the question was whether insolence, the crime of insolence by a free black person was going to be treated the same as the crime of insolence by an enslaved black person. And the court said yes. They said, it is unfortunate that this third category exists in our society. All we can do is make it accommodate itself to the permanent rights of free white men. But as compared with the slave, how stands the case? If a slave is insolent, he may be whipped by his master or by order of a justice of the peace. But a free master, a free Negro, has no master to correct him. A justice of the peace cannot have him punished for insolence. It is not an indictable offense. And unless a white man to whom insolence is given has the right to put a stop to it in an extrajudicial way, there is no remedy for it. This would be insufferable. So a free black being insolent to a white person was treated as something that could be responded to with physical force in the same way as if a slave was insolent to a white person. So every white person is the police. The laws are vague and discretionary. That's the pre-Civil War situation. And what I want to ask is, where is the disjunctive moment? Where is the moment in US law where a decision was made as a society to eliminate the influence of race from the law books, root and branch? Now, there were, it cannot be denied, tremendous changes in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The legal situation has changed, but it was not comprehensive and systematic. It was issue by issue, point by point, and it was deeply resisted. If there is such a disjunctive moment where there's a real examination of the legal system, it's now. We're living in it. But But there was no decision that I'm aware of historically where the legal community as a whole said, now is the time we have to eliminate race discrimination from our law books at least. And the case that illustrates that for me is this Knight versus State case from the Mississippi Supreme Court in 1964. They affirmed the convictions of a bunch of freedom riders for disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct, Professor Jamelia Morgan reminds us in a recent issue of the California Law Review, is the type of statute that can be used like insolence to get to give the police a lot of discretion to arrest who they want. The disorderly conduct of the defendants in Knight versus State was failure to disperse when attacked by a white mob at a bus stop. And the police exercised their discretion, as they had the perfect right to do, to arrest the freedom riders, not prevent the white mob from attacking. It's their discretion. Can't criticize them for that. And this is what the court talked about the elements of the offense and whether the trial was legitimate, but they also put the incident in historical context. This court, like everyone else, is somewhat conversant with historical facts. Hence, it knows that slavery as a legal institution existed in this country from the earliest colonial days. That status continued unabated even after the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed to the world in 1776, and thereafter beyond the adoption of the Constitution itself. As a matter of fact, it took a cruel and bloody civil war to uproot it from all sections of the country. Even after the newly freed slaves were enfranchised, there was little difference thereafter in the racial attitudes insofar as the social intercourse and acceptance were concerned. Certain sections of the country, since the time when the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, because of physical traits and differences between the white and colored races and other disparities real to them, although perhaps imaginary to others, observed and practiced segregation of the races. Even the great crusader for freedom and the emancipator of the slaves recognized that these differences placed a severe limitation on the full measure of freedom for them. Separate schools in many areas were provided. But suddenly the equalitarian doctrine began to take root in the land and has apparently met with substantial acceptance in recent years. Within a decade, novel constructions have nullified settled constitutional questions. Segregation in schools and in all means of public transportation has been declared at an end by judicial fiat. The cry by certain groups for conformity to their beliefs rings out endlessly over the land through the various media of communications. Large numbers of people in this broad land are steeped in their customs, practices, mores, and traditions. In many instances, their beliefs go as deep or deeper than religion itself. Now, I just found this passage stunning when I first read it, because this is the Mississippi Supreme Court, an elected court that has some sense, I think, of the views of the people of Mississippi. This is not Jack Chin, critical race theorist, saying these people are incredibly racist. They probably think that segregation is more important than religion. And then, I'm the bad person. They said it. And it seems to me that that's a remarkable thing. I want to close by saying, there were so many things that happened earlier in this conference and questions that should have been discussed. And I wanted to make a comment to Professor Ayatero, who asked what I think is the key question, one of the key questions about this whole topic, and that is, why do some people feel the need to be superior over other people? And I think in the context of the criminal justice system, the answer is money and status. And W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the psychological wage of whiteness, but it's also, in the criminal justice system and elsewhere, a real wage, a cash wage. The criminal justice system provides good jobs at good wages for a lot of people. And if there wasn't disproportionate African-American incarceration and involvement, a lot of people would have to find something else to do. And they wouldn't have the kinds of pensions and benefits and excitement that they have in their jobs. And I think that the topic of this panel is slavery in the criminal justice system. And I think that is probably unique to the criminal justice system, that so many people's livelihoods depend on the continuing existence of discrimination. It would be intolerable and unacceptable, of course, for this many white people to be in prison and in the clutches of the criminal justice system. Thanks.
On now? Okay. All right. I see why you didn't want to follow this guy. He actually prepared a paper and is citing case law. Damn. So for me, I like to say people's perspective on the law and legal institutions is usually framed on their interaction with them, how they first encountered them. For me, I was really excited to be on this panel because I know what it's like to have an institution or have someone have ownership of your body. I served 27 years in prison. 10 of those were in solitary confinement. Went in at the age of 16, was released at the age of 44. At the age of 16, the state tried to kill me. So I had to learn the law. And me and my family had to learn the law because I was facing a death sentence for being a lookout to a drug-related homicide on my 16th birthday. So I entered the carceral state and had to use the law as a weapon to defend myself and free myself. When I was incarcerated, for me, going to the law library, reading books was a measure of seizing back control of my destiny. And several things really stood out to me. As one, I was very fortunate during many of those stints in solitary confinement to run into political prisoners in Pennsylvania who became my mentors. The late Russell Maroon Schultz, who recently passed from cancer. He was one of our clients. We were able to get him home on compassionate release. He served 51 years in prison. He died less than 2 months after he came home, but it was satisfaction that he died surrounded by his family in the warmth of his home and not shackled to a prison cell, to a gurney in a prison cell. Mumia Abu-Jamal, Arthur Chetaway Johnson, another one of my mentors who we just released after 50 years in prison. He went into prison in 1972 and he was released this summer. And they were resistance fighters. And for me being 16, 17, 18 years old in solitary confinement, I needed something to read. I needed something to engage my mind. And they weren't giving me nonsense. They were sending us down American Negro slave revolts, Maroon societies by Richard Price. And one of the things I really remember thinking about some of the cases you cited was Commonwealth versus Ruffin. And that's a case out of Virginia, and I believe it was in like 1879. And in that case, the court was debating whether or not this particular prisoner had certain rights within prison. And I believe it was in that case where a judicial court in the United States first used the term that a prisoner is a slave of the state. And any rights, any privileges, or anything that he has it basically at the mercy of the state legislature, of the state that it provides him. And I remember reading that and saying, damn, my predicament makes sense, right? How this system can sentence me to spend the rest of my life in prison at the age of 16, how this prison can keep men and women in solitary confinement for decades. You know, Arthur Chetaway Johnson, who came home after 50 years in prison, did 38 consecutive years in solitary confinement. He went into solitary confinement in 1979 and got out in 2016. And so you're disposable. When the state can do that to you, you're disposable. And that's what enslaved people were on the slave plantation. Prison as the slave regime is not something new. I think it's something that the academic world is slowly catching on to. But if you were to read the works of George Jackson, if you were to read Joy James, who wrote a book called The New Abolitionist, and if you read a lot of the prison literature from the 60s and 70s, prisoners then were calling prisons plantations. George Jackson in 1971 said that we're the modern day Nat Turners and Denmark Bassies. So for me, when I look at this system, you know, when it comes to the carceral state, human beings are capital. But they're not financial capital anymore because prisons are not profitable. You know, that's a myth. Prisons are not profitable. Even private prisons only constitute 7% of the total amount of prisoners that are held in prisons in this country. But it's a political capital. It's political capital. And Black and brown bodies and poor people are used and traded off in state legislators across the state in order to enhance political parties' power, particularly racist political parties. You know, we live in a country right now where essentially the modern Republican Party essentially is a white nationalist party. It's a party that is openly running on a white nationalist and white supremacist platform. Something that, you know, what we saw the last 4 years, you know, makes George W. Bush look like a liberal. That's something I think about, right? And I remember George W. Bush, you know, I remember his father. I remember the Willie Horton ads as a kid because they paved the way for me at the age of 16 years old to be sentenced to life without prison and facing a death sentence. And they all had a racial component to them. They all presented Black youth as social predators, as super predators. And they were all kicked up, boosted up during election cycle because there is an underlying fear in this country that can be easily tapped into. And that fear is Black people. That fear is Black youth. And what's really ironic about it is that when you really look at the struggle of Black and brown people in this country, our struggle has never been a struggle to take something from someone else. It's always been a struggle to assert rights that we inherently have, right? And so the prison system and the carceral state is essentially the tool that is used to suppress these rights. And it's also used to keep these communities, our communities in line. So again, you know, for me, when I think about what this panel is about and the vestiges of slavery, I don't really have to like look far, read too many books. I know that, you know, there's probably a prison 20 or 30 miles from this university. You could walk into that prison and you're going to see the modern vestiges of slavery played out every single day in that institution. And it wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. When chattel slavery was ended, the entire governing philosophy of the plantation was just shifted into the prison. Because prisons really didn't, Black people weren't in prison during slavery. We were already in prison, right? The entire slave regime was a prison. So after slavery, that's when the philosophy, the underpinnings of the plantation pretty much became state law. It became administrative policy within prisons. And so those are the vestiges that we see today. And that's why we're abolitionists, because we know that they need to be removed. They need to be dismantled. They need to be demolished. And that's the work that we do at the Abolitionist Law Center. We dismantle the carceral state. We're unapologetic at it. Our objective is to free people from prisons, to roll back state power, to erode police power. So I'll leave it like that and look forward to the panel.
Okay, well, it's tough to follow you, but thank you so much for, you know, centering this conversation around lived experience. I think that's essential in these moments and in these conversations. I also wanted to thank my dear friend, Professor Malveaux, and Dean Buckner-Innes and the Byron White Center for putting on just such a great event and a great conference, and also to Professor Levin for facilitating and moderating this conversation. So I just thought I'd take a second to underscore how urgent this discussion is today. I mean, we just don't have enough conversations about the legacy of the institution of slavery, or acknowledge that we live in a post-apartheid, post-slavery world. Like, that is the regime that we're in. And so in some ways, we're here to speak about our work in the context of the legacy of slavery, but almost everything it should be thought of in that lens and through that framework. And I guess I'll take a second to say there's such a dissonance between what we're talking about today and the fact that, we're having this conversation in a law school and what's happening on the state level with the attack on critical race theory and conversations about race. I mean, we're at the point where the next generation of children may not even be able to learn about this. So, this is in some ways a brave conversation to have as well, as a necessary one. And, it's just important for us to keep that in mind as well. So my work focuses on, a variety of policing topics and race. And, there's a clear connection between enslavement, the institution of slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act, slave patrols, and modern day policing. I think people have already kind of surfaced that. Thank you, Professor Higginbotham. And I think that the projects I'm working on right now are really looking at the way that in our public institutions and their carceral nature allows police to naturalize themselves within it. So if we think about any of our public institutions, whether it's schools or hospitals, mass transit, emergency rooms, you'll see police there. And why is that? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's one of the things I'm thinking about right now. And it's very racialized policing. It's a way of determining who belongs in a space and who doesn't. It's a way of otherizing mostly Black bodies, but also other bodies that are considered deviant or out of the ordinary, or behave in a way that is outside of the norm of kind of white middle class society. And so those are some of the things I'm thinking about right now. And the last project I worked on is looking at healthcare specifically, and just thinking about the way that police presence dictates the way poor people, and especially poor Black people, experience the healthcare that they receive in the health institutions. And one of the things I'll just kind of touch on, because Professor Chin raised this issue of jobs, is something that I'm starting to think about, is the way that labor unions in all of these public sectors have had a role in the rise of policing. And so we know about that in the context of prisons. We know that the prison industrial complex is built in part because labor unions supported the idea of more jobs in their communities. But we can also see that if we think about teachers unions or nurses unions, and it's not a uniform debate or a uniform situation. In many cities, you see some unions coming out against more police in these institutions, and in other cities they say they don't want the police. But I think this is sort of an unearthed area of the way that the policing institution has emerged as the naturalized way of dealing with public safety in our public institutions. If you're in a healthcare setting, maybe that would be a natural place to think about a social worker intervening if there's some issue with the patient instead of a police officer. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Hey everyone, it is so wonderful to see you, and I'm so honored to be a part of this amazing conversation with all of these people. I'm going to, and all of the preceding things, but I'm trying to keep my eye on the time, and I just want to dive into what I want to say. So I thought I would start with sharing a little bit of my own lived experience of another sort, which is to start with being a law student. And sitting in the classrooms when we're talking about really any course that intersects with race and poverty, and to hear the humanity removed from everyone, from all of the analysis. In fact, the project of a legal education often feels like removing the humanity and dignity of the individuals and the situations in which we're discussing. And so I couldn't really handle that. Like that didn't make a lot of sense to me. I didn't even understand the analysis. And so after law school, I decided to go get a PhD in sociology to try to get some training in actually focusing on human beings and their lived experience. And I also, before doing the PhD, worked at Legal Aid Society of DC and was there largely focused on welfare policy, child support policy. What I'm underscoring here is that I wasn't focusing on the criminal legal system in my mind. And then when I started grad school, I moved away and then I came back to DC and was interviewing Black mothers, largely from disadvantaged backgrounds, about their experiences with the state writ large. Again, not setting out to study policing or the criminal system necessarily. What I was hearing over and over again, to echo a lot of what Professor Patel was just saying, is like this policing as a through line in all of people's engagements with systems and the state writ large. And so that kind of forced me to like focus on policing and the criminal system because of, like, if you want to understand the nature of racial oppression in the contemporary United States, you have to understand policing and the criminal system is deeply like fundamental and not just like a consequence, one of many consequences of racial oppression. And so like after doing these interviews and realizing that I was gonna have to learn a whole new area that I wasn't planning to focus on, I started doing some reading, largely in sociology, because that was my training, even though, as Saleem was pointing out, there was lots of material that was kind of understanding the nature of prison long before this. And I was reading Loic Quant, and I think his analysis of history and the connections between enslavement and contemporary society are really important here. So just a quick shorthand. He traces this idea that we can understand the nature of anti-Black racial oppression in the United States in kind of 4 stages that he calls, he says, we have enslavement, we have Jim Crow, then we have the rise of the ghetto, and we could think about that as ghettoization, and happy to talk more about what that means. But then we have the rise of the combination between the prison and the hyper ghetto, he calls it. And one of the things that's really critical to my work is to focus on how the prison and the hyper ghetto are not separate institutions, they're operating at the same time. And particularly when thinking about what hyper ghettoization is, policing is core to that. So just to say, realizing that I was like, oh, I'm almost out of time and I haven't even talked about my own work yet substantively. But one of the things I did want to share from my work has been examining precisely this linkage between policing and residential segregation as a reinstantiation of the hyper ghetto. So I've just one article that I published in NYU Law Review called Anti-Segregation Policing that came out a couple of years ago breaks down 6 different ways in which policing is not just a consequence of pre-existing residential segregation or pre-existing racial oppression, but instead reinforces the spatial landscape on which policing is operating. So for example, and this is like basic to policing, how do you tell when something is suspicious? When police officers say they use their gut, right? And gut is often racialized, like looking at who seems out of place. This type of analysis, this type of use of policing is sanctioned by the Supreme Court as acceptable. And so a white person looks out of place, a Black person looks out of, well, how would you know what out of place is? You have to have a segregated landscape in which to do that. And police do that work every day by kind of, identifying and putting people in particular sorts of places. But it's not just at the level of officer. And I'm just gonna highlight one more thing just because of time, but there's 6. But the one I wanna highlight is how policing distributes racialized economic value. So what do I mean by that? the way police departments in urban and suburban areas tends to operate is by providing different types of services to different types of racialized neighborhoods. So in predominantly white, affluent suburban areas, you know, police can kind of operate as like, they're present, by the way. It's not that they're absent. You know, there's a lot of research on this, but the presence is often, you know, benign and let's give, it's like services. It's like all the services that people, it's like real community policing actually often happens in white affluent areas. Just one quick example, and then I promise I'll stop. So one of the places that I studied is Dallas, Texas, where the Dallas Police Department actually has this thing called extended neighborhood patrol, where neighborhood associations can get together, pool their money, and pay for community policing. So what do I mean by that? Each household contributes X $100 to the pot, and then they get, the people in the neighborhood get a direct line to a particular police officer who will work in a uniformed capacity in their community, even if it's technically off hours. Importantly, they provide services like coming by your house if you're out of town to you know, make sure it doesn't look like no one's home, conducting a safety audit of your home, all of these extra services. That's what policing looks like in some places, and we know what harsh policing looks like in race, class, marginalized areas. That itself is reinstantiating this hyper ghetto and reinforcing these deep racial and economic divides, and that in itself is deeply rooted to our history of slavery, and I'll stop there.
Great. So now you see, now I wish that everyone had twice as much time to speak. But so I have a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of questions to ask the group. And the first one I think picks up with what I see as a theme across everyone's work and really throughout the conference so far, and going to last night, and the monologues and the discussion afterwards, and that's law and sort of the place of law, right? Sunita reminds us, like, we're in a law school and there's something kind of amazing about having these conversations there, right? Jack asks us to think about what is the actual disjunctive moment, right? When did the law stop being an institution that manages to uphold or struggles to uphold or works to uphold racial hierarchy, right? Saleem describes that experience of seeing law as sort of like this necessary weapon, but also the thing that did that work. And Monica describes the experience that I think to law students, to lawyers in the room, that many of us and to law professors, I hope, think about, but have had a feeling like the law is doing this work. And in some ways, my question for all of you is to think about that last tension, that tension between the law as institution and the humans who are there, who, I guess, upon whose bodies, as Saleem puts it, the law does its work, right? So how do you see that tension? How do you see kind of the work of centering the humans in what it is that you do? And how do you see the absence of humans and humanity as central to the way that the law, and particularly the criminal law, has done the work that I think collectively we're so concerned about?
Are we going this way?
Anyone who wants to jump in.
Okay, I'm gonna start just because something popped into mind, which is my colleague Miriam Gohara's work about basically Black victims of crime. And basically, this is what we understand to be true if we actually focus on the humans, is that often people who experience victimhood are also the same people who are labeled as perpetrator. And one of the deep problems of the way we engage in legal analysis is that there's no human complexity. There's no understanding of these cycles. There's blame, there's culpability assigned for structural issues. I mean, I'm thinking very much about, what we saw last night. And I'm thinking about the monologue that you read, Derek Bell's monologue, Suzette, Professor Malvo, and hearing a story about loyalty. It's about, that was a story about loyalty, which is something that we all care about that is so deeply human, but his loyalty had to be labeled with criminality because of just particular issues and dynamics. And it's I could totally be there. I'm a super loyal person. And, and so I think that erasure in legal analysis is the problem.
I think that's a $1 million question, because people who are impacted by the law, the carceral state, are damaged human beings, right? And just going on a one-on-one from a client standpoint, right? How do you humanize, not how do you, you have to take into consideration just so many problems that the person is facing, and particularly the trauma. Like we talk about movement lawyering, and I think about a case where we were representing the mother whose son was killed by prison guards. And I can recall I know how to compartmentalize, because that's what prison does to you. I know how to shut it down, I know how to turn it off. But I'm sitting across the table from someone that I've gotten to know through years on this case, and is passionate and is going through something that I could never imagine. She lost her son was murdered, right? He was asthmatic, and the guards pepper sprayed him, and then when he was handcuffed and on the ground, they pepper sprayed him again. And when they were escorting him to the solitary confinement, they pepper sprayed him some more. He said he couldn't breathe. They said he was faking. They said, you're talking so you're breathing. And this was traumatic for her. And so I just think of how tough that case was to have to get to a point of settlement in this case. And she did not want to settle, but she didn't want to go to trial. And I just think it felt like a wrestling match, right? And I just remember leaving out like, yo, I've never been so emotionally drained, right? How do you center that, right? How do it got to a point where basically I said, listen, this is what's going to be done. They're going to paint your son as this, as this, as this. This is what we're going to have to do. You have to, like, at the end of the day, get down to the cold facts of the case. But I don't have an answer for like how you do it, because every case is different. Every situation is different. What we try and do is, one, we try and bring and center people on our staff and in our movement that have lived experience, but also know what they're doing in fighting the carceral state. And it almost sounds hard to say this, but people as humans, right? That's something that coming out of prison was something that I had to like really, well, not even coming out, it started in prison, just to treat fellow prisoners as human, right? Because prison dehumanizes you, and so you in turn dehumanize other people. But it's really tough, because I don't believe, this system doesn't care about human beings. This system is not about justice, it's about vengeance, it's about politics. And so for us trying to come up with a way of humanizing people, humanizing the law, I don't think it's possible within the system. This is an adversarial system. It's as Malcolm X said, it's a morally bankrupt system, but it's a system that I have to engage in, and that we all have to engage in. Because in America, any space that you don't contest, particularly Black and brown people, that you don't contest for, where there's power, someone else is going to do that. And then more often than not, whoever occupies that space is going to be someone that's harmful to your interests, right? So yeah, I don't have the answer to this. I know I struggle over it every day in each case.
So I'll just add briefly that, I had, before I became a law professor, one of the privileges that I had was to represent basically every Black and brown person in New York City that was stopped and frisked in the class action lawsuit against the NYPD. And I'll say that trial, being a trial attorney in that case, was exactly a test of putting people's humanity in the front of the case. I mean, every stage, when you think about the practice of law, you actually can do that. I mean, we have to negotiate these things all the time, but who testifies first? Is it going to be your expert witness or your lead plaintiff, right? Do you make the case theory about race or not? Believe it or not, major civil rights attorneys told us to drop our 14th Amendment equal protection claim. And we were like, no, because our clients would not stand for that, right? So, there's a way in which you have to hold yourself accountable to what you know the truths are, to the people who are actually affected by the policies that you're challenging, and to, as I said in the beginning, like continuously remind yourself that this is about the legacy of slavery. How can you erase race from a major police case or a major policing discussion? You can't, right?
I kind of echo Robert's comments that it's going to be very hard for the system to become humane, because that would require abandoning this idea that everyone is independently responsible for their situation and they didn't work hard enough and that's why they're in this situation, or they could have worked harder, it's their own fault somehow. So level playing field, equal opportunity, this is what you did with it, this is on you. And I think it's going to be deeply uncomfortable for many actors in the system to embrace that. It does come out, when you're involved in a sentencing, the Richard Delgado rotten social background stuff does come in, and the courts sometimes take it into account. Of course, sometimes they take it into account perversely, but there are, individual offices, individual judges, individual prosecutors where this kind of argument is treated with some sympathy. But as a whole, I just don't think that the system can open up the question and start to examine it. This is McCleskey versus Kemp, because the answer is going to be very difficult to live with.
So another question that, again, I think each of your comments makes me think of, and each of your work makes me think of, is really sort of the uniqueness of criminal law. And I think it's something that we've been thinking about and talking about throughout the day today and to last night, right? That for so many of us and in so many movements and in so many of the uprising and protests that we've seen over the past couple of years, policing and criminal law becomes the language, becomes the place or the site where many people who might not either otherwise be impacted or might not have as clear a sense see that injustice and see that injustice most strongly. But one question I have for all of you, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is what it is that's different. Why is criminal law, if we're trying to find an institution that seems like it's continuing on the legacy of slavery, is criminal law somehow unique in that, or is it just the one that kind of that's most obvious, right? What makes criminal institutions different from institutions of housing or other institutions of public welfare? Is it just sort of the worst case of these broader pathologies, these broader forms of white supremacy, or is there something different that you see about criminal law and its history?
Okay, I will jump in on that one. Ben, you're killing us with these questions.
You stumped us.
So listen, I think criminal law is the most harmful arm of the state, right? And I think that's why, I think George Jackson once said that the expression of political power in America is not the police, it's the courts, right? Yeah. And that's because that's what will lead you to prison, that's what will take your rights away, that's what will take your wealth. Yeah. The legal system will strip you bare to your bone. It will take your soul in many cases. And so when I look at the criminal justice system, whatever you want to call it, I look at it as the strong arm of the state. I look at it as a tool that the state employs and it uses to prevent social change, social justice. For me, that's its only function. I don't believe that it exists to end crime or even deal with crime, right? Because in the United States, we have more people incarcerated than any country in the world, but yet we're not, do you feel safe in your community, right? So police and prisons do not equate safety. So that's oftentimes for poor Black and brown people, their first contact with the state is with the criminal justice system, right? With police. although public schools, the school to prison pipeline is connected too, but who's in those schools now? Police officers, right? Who's coming to your house if you hooky school or you don't go to school, or who's picking you up? Or if you don't go to school, who do you have a chance of having an encounter with? It's the police, and that leads you into the courtroom. So I think that people, when it comes to criminal law and the legal system, for me, it's just the glue that binds this oppressive social contract. And as an abolitionist, you know, I'm really fond of saying that prisons, police, criminal justice systems, they're not an anomaly, right, in American society. They're part and parcel of it, right? They all spring from the same social contract that has governed this country since its inception, right? And so abolition of these systems, to me, does not look like just abolishing police and prisons. It's ultimately abolishing the social contract that has governed the United States. So I don't look at the criminal justice system as like something separate or some anomaly within the system. Like when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about social services, those are all connected.
Yeah, and I just, if I can just jump in and say, I think that the way I think about police is that you know, policing, criminal law, it's enforcing white supremacy, it's entrenching, and it's making sure that, you know, it's a through line in all these social institutions. And, you know, it's there to protect, in many ways, to protect white property and white cultural spaces, right? So I just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say, it's interesting because my initial reaction to your question, Professor Levin, is kind of like, was like, no, I actually don't think the criminal system is unique or necessarily even more harmful, but for the fact that, like, so I'm thinking about, again, sociology, so I was thinking about Weber. And it's like, you know, when we think about what police are, it's like, you know, well, the state has a monopoly on the legitimated use of force, and what institution in the contemporary US has legitimate use of force is police. And so it comes very much back to what's already been said about the state, or about police being the enforcers of a particular set of orders. But I do think sometimes, just to be like a little even self-critical, I think sometimes we are criticizing police, and especially, and I'm saying police very specifically and not prisons and the prison industrial complex. I'm talking about the public discussion. We really focus a lot on policing, partly because of the particular sorts of bodily violence that of course happens most aggressively within prisons and what policing does in prisons, but also out in the street. So there's that physical violence. And also the visibility of policing, like kind of street policing. Again, you know, and again, Saleem reminds us of school policing, which has another layer of invisibility to it. But I think the structures that are actually driving everything are often invisible. So like I'm thinking about the oppression that happens because of our tax system and our economic system. Like, you know, it's like, well, why do we have these sorts of inequalities? Like what are the arrangements? Like police are really the back end of that. But there's also a really oppressive front end that we often lose sight of in political discourse. And so I just think it's important to hold all of that and to situate our analysis. And this is very much coming back to what Saleem just said about what abolition has to mean. It's not just about policing in prisons and prison-related institutions. It has to be about structural redesign. And that, I think, is why I wouldn't say that police and the criminal system are like unique or especially oppressive or beyond other things.
I would say that the unique parts of, excuse me, I have something going on with my, the unique parts of the criminal justice system are significant. They have to do with the lack of market discipline. The police and the corrections system and the prosecutors' offices don't have to explain that their decisions are economically rational or otherwise rational. Everybody knows it's an expenditure without a return. It's also a site that has an enormous amount of autonomy and discretion. And I think, you see these, if you look at the intricacies of the criminal justice system, law enforcement agencies and prosecutors can go out and get grants to do what they want. And you can go to a private organization and have them give you $1 million so you can fund a prosecutor to prosecute the things that you want to prosecute, or have the police go to a particular neighborhood and say, listen, we're concerned about X, Y, and Z. We want you to arrest people for that. And so police and prosecutors have the opportunity to do things that don't require the city or the state to authorize or pay. You see these task forces that are made of jointly appointed, cross-deputized state and federal officers, and they're doing whatever they want. There's no boss. Or the boss is the person who got the grant. And then I think another factor is the necessity for selective enforcement. The police have to look busy. They are accountable in terms of numbers. If what you said is, everything is so great, we didn't make any arrests last year, then, well, we can get rid of a bunch of the police, can't we? So they have to look busy. They have to be able to say, we did this number of cases. And yet, as I mentioned before, it's my belief that it would be unacceptable for harsh policing tactics to be used on white communities. After Ferguson, I kind of joked with my class at one point, gee, why do you think that the Sacramento Police Department, where I am, you could go over to the University of California Davis Health Center, and those doctors have a lot of money to pay parking tickets. Why don't they do hyper enforcement over by the hospital? You can, ticket those people and really bring in the money. And the answer is because that would last about 45 minutes before those cops were reassigned. You can't mulct people who have political power. You can only mulct people who have no ability to resist, who can't say, no, thank you, I don't want your negative value police services, do that somewhere else. So I can't think of another institution in society where, yes, there's racism and discrimination everywhere, but the other major institutions, I don't think are in the same, have the same level of freedom to say, yeah, just to heck with black and brown and other non-white people, I don't think that would work for the healthcare system or for universities, even though they, of course, are not free of bias.
Great. One thing too, I just want to say, touch on that. After Orlando Castillo was killed, I think it was in Minnesota, there was an editorial that was written by a police chief that said, if you don't want me to kill you, do what I say.
Right.
There is no other institution in America where someone could say something like that, right? And essentially say that bluntly, basically saying there's going to be no accountability either, right? It was almost as if he was speaking to sheep, right? Like, I don't even know, you wouldn't even hear, you didn't even hear anything like that. Like, that's something you would probably hear like Stalin say to someone or something like that, right? And he probably wouldn't have said it that blunt, right?
Right.
But that's part of the uniqueness of policing in America. But also, again, let's trace this back to where that comes from. Black life had no value to slave patrols. Black life had no value to police, right? And that police power was predicated and built on that from the plantation, you're my property. I could do with you as I please. I could kill you, I could feed you, I could starve you. So that's, it's just part of those vestiges of slavery today. And that's why it's so unique that someone like could write an editorial and be so blunt saying that, basically daring you to do something about it.
Great. So I have more questions, but I want to open things up and I want to actually leave some space for others. To start us off, and while the microphones start making the rounds, We have a Zoom question that's come in, so I want to bring this to the group. This is from Zach Palmer. So Zach Palmer wants to know, how do the panelists think we can best address modern slavery through prison labor as far as community organizing? So the question asks, I started a coalition to abolish prison slavery at my local university, and I'm struggling to gain momentum and to think about how to address this.
I mean, I can't tell people how to, you know, it sounds like this person's doing a lot of real work, but I do have some like initial reactions. So, I mean, I think one of the big issues with prison labor in particular, I mean, there are multiple big issues with that kind of drive a kind of less focus on prison labor as a real problem. One is this question about like productivity in prison. Like, so there's a weird coalition of people who like doesn't really understand the nature of like what prison labor is. And it's not just general like work that's affirming. It's in fact paying people pennies on the dollar to do really oppressive and dehumanizing work. Right. And so I think there's a lack of awareness about the fundamental nature of what prison labor is. And also there's a lack of awareness about the system, like broader system to bring it back to like, and this is a conversation that happened, I can't remember whether it was early this morning or last night, but like about the role of particular forms of capitalism in the relationship between prison labor and that. So I think making that really clear to people, but then it all comes back to, at the end of the day, the profound dehumanization and invisibility of like how people are negatively affected by these forms of labor. So I would encourage that person to really try to tell the story more through like human stories and not through statistics about how prison labor is negative. But I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. Hands.
Can you see me?
I can see you, yes, absolutely. I think we have a microphone coming for you.
Oh,
great, thank you.
Just to get your feedback on. The first is that now it's very clear, based upon scientific research, that Black children are not really seen as children. And therefore, they are not treated as children. And we're seeing more and more of how law enforcement officers treat Black children in relationship to white children. And we've seen it a lot over the past year or so. And I just think about the young white man who was allowed to cross state lines and actually go to that protest rally and kill 2 people and injure 1 severely. And he was able to just walk away, basically, and taken to get something to eat and to drink. If that had been a young Black man or even a young Black woman, the same treatment would not have occurred. So I wanted to get your perspective on what that does to a community where its children are not seen as children. And then the second observation is that oftentimes people think that police control everything because they'll look at law and order or something like that. And they do not understand that really it's the prosecutorial officers that determine what cases will be prosecuted, what kind of charges will be brought, what are the sentencing recommendations, which usually are accepted by the court. Now, I have to say that I started as a Black prosecutor here in the state of Colorado. I was really, really fortunate in that I worked for a district attorney who was all about humanity, who gave us total autonomy to do justice. However, things have changed over the decades where even in prosecutorial offices, there are like quotas that are being set and that determine how successful a prosecutor will be and able to go on to a big firm and make a lot of money. So I just wanted to see if any of you had any perspectives on either or both of those observations. Thank you.
Well, I would say, as you know, as a prosecutor, I think there are prosecutors' offices that are trying to avoid discrimination. There's a new thing that's going on where the reports that prosecutors review are de-raced so that they can not have bias when they make a charging decision. You know, the problem is that you only, as a prosecutor, see the cases that the police bring to you for the most part. And if the racism is at the police level, if there is racism in that particular jurisdiction that manifests in that way, the prosecutors aren't going to know it. And so they may think, hey, we can prove that we're treating like cases alike because here's all our cases and this is what we did. But that doesn't mean that upstream there wasn't something else going on. You know, a little racism at every step of the way, because there's so many discretionary decision points, can really add up to, well, it does, in my humble opinion, add up to the racial disparity that we see in the prison system. That's the outcome.
Police departments, because there clearly is. What I'm trying to convey is just what you said. There is discrimination, racial discrimination at the police level, the stop and frisk, we began there, that permeates through the prosecutorial offices and then on to the judiciary. And we have a very poor representation of people of color at each of those levels, which makes the discrimination more rampant in my own view. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
I want to touch on that though too, because representation does not mean justice. In Philadelphia, you know, we had a Black district attorney. We had Black first district attorneys that were more than willing to carry on the racist regime of their predecessor, Lynn Abraham. Philadelphia police. Listen.
Ramsey.
And I should clarify that I'm talking about those people who were there to do justice, because you're absolutely.
I agree with you. What I'm saying is that you
alluded to that there are some of us who I actually, in my elementary school, had a teacher whose grandson is Mr. Cameron over there in Kentucky, who, you know, he didn't even bring the evidence to the grand jury that he should have presented. So thank you for that qualification.
and listen, all of us are trying to do justice in a system that cannot bring justice and is not built on justice, right? And it's tension, it's frustrating for all of us, right? Prosecutor's office, look, I'm from Philadelphia. We helped elect what you would call a progressive prosecutor. As an abolitionist, I don't believe there's such thing as a progressive prosecutor. But Larry Krasner is someone that I would defend, right? Yeah. And he has transformed that office. And he's, you know, just to give you some context, Philadelphia's district attorney's office was the deadliest DA's office in the country, right? Lynn Abraham was called America's deadliest DA. That office sent more children to spend the rest of their life in prison than any other state in the country. And more than any other state in the country, and has sentenced more children to die in prison than any country in the world. That city alone, under Lynn Abraham's regime. She sent more people to death row than any other prosecutor in the country, even prosecutors in Harris County and in Louisiana. Philadelphia has the highest percentage of people serving life without parole sentences than any other city in the state, in the country. It has more people serving life without parole, Philadelphia alone. I'm not talking about the state. Only 5 states have more people serving life without parole. He's come out supporting parole for lifers in Pennsylvania. He's joined a lawsuit seeking to abolish the death sentence in Pennsylvania because of its racial disparities, right? He has a matrix in his office where he compares how much less prison time his office has given than his predecessors. At this point now, it's like 15,000 less years of incarceration than his predecessor, right? So from that standpoint, I believe that there are individuals that can do some measure of justice within the system. But it still has to be more. He still has to go further. I'm the type that's like, all right, good, Larry, how much further you willing to go? And by the way, I'm gonna push you further. And I think that's a lesson for a lot of us who are in the legal field, that, and I alluded to that earlier about contesting for power. Previously, if you would have told me, and we did this when I was in prison. I was in prison in 2017 when he was elected, but we have a movement that's on the outside and on the inside composed of our families. And so when the word came in that we're gonna support, do you guys wanna support Larry Krasner for a district attorney? You could imagine a lot of us were like, man, he said, for what? District attorney? But the flip side is that we knew him. He represented protesters beaten at the Republican convention in Philadelphia in 2001 who were protesting. He represented Black Lives Matter activists. He represented victims of police abuse. And it was like, yo, the FOP's against him? Cool. That got our stamp from people, right? So we supported him, right? And like I said, I never would have thought that I would be sitting across from him or sitting across from people in his office, in an office that tried to kill me when I was a kid, right? Negotiating cases to bring people home, or even talking with them about supporting legislation, decarceral legislation in Pennsylvania. So again, we can do our individual doses of justice, you know, within this system, but at the end of the day, I don't believe 100 Larry Krasners are not going to make this system better, right? So I don't want to diminish your work or the work of other people that are trying to do justice in the system. I'm trying to do it. People on this panel are trying to do it. It's just that we're doing it in a system that is not predicated or built on receiving justice.
I have to tell you, I did not believe that our system is capable of becoming one where we do justice. I could not continue to be a lawyer. I just could not, because I am an officer of the court, as are all of you. So that is where we differ in terms of our perspectives. And institutions are no more than the people. And we, the people, have to bring about change. And it's possible, but we have to understand the issues and the problems and the obstacles and get to the point where we are really going to focus on those things. And I don't want to monopolize, but I definitely wanted to share that. So thank you.
Great. So we have another hand up front over here. Yes, wonderful.
Hi, thank you.
I totally disagree with her, but that was my question really under that context. Is, to me, the problem is we're attempting to make a system just that the very foundation of it is injustice. And I don't see how you can change that. So I know Robert is an abolitionist. I happen to see a program with you on it. But how do we at the same time we have to deal with, you know, what is it, the ball that's in front of us, you know? How do we at the same time work to envision and implement, not just envision, but implement a system that is based on love, based on recognizing that all human beings need A, B, C, D, E, and it's not a punitive system. I coined the phrase, I don't know if I coined it, but I started using the phrase many years ago. This system is a criminal punishment system. It is not a justice system. It is not, it has never been one. But how do we do that? Because I think that's the rub not the rub, that's not the right phrase. That's the difficulty, many of us who see the need to abolish this system and create one that is based on building human beings' lives and supporting them, is at the same time we're hit every day with another injustice that we got to get in front of, that we got to build. And so I just, that's my question. I do have a comment, because you tried to answer my question, which I had already answered. I don't think it's just wealth, because I don't think that we would have that the need to feel that you're better than someone is based on just the need to get money, because we have many examples where that's not the case. So, but I would like if you could, my question.
Yeah, I'll jump in on some of that. I think this is so fascinating. I mean, I think we just really seeing here one of the big challenges of precisely trying to do work that is abolitionist in his visions, and by abolitionist having a really capacious view of what that means, while also recognizing that we're in systems right now, and the people who are working within those systems have to, I mean, there has to be something that gets you up in the morning. I mean, I'll say for myself, like, you know, the way I think about it is I'm trying to be engaged in a project of harm reduction of a really violent system in the here and now. But then we have to be in coalition with other people. There is no individual who can simultaneously have a vision for how we're going to truly reach abolitionist visions and also at the same time do the work of the system. So this is why I think actually being in community with people with lots of different types of skills and what they're bringing to it. It's like, what am I bringing to it? I'm an academic, I can't practice law. You know, like I can't, like I'm not, you know, deeply embedded in communities in such a way that like I should be doing the visioning, but I have my own role. And I just think that's really, really important to do here. Now, there are some people who are working within the system. There are some lawyers who need to believe they're doing justice. And I'm like, well, please believe that. I think that personally, I don't need to have that view. I think the view that is more important to have, at least as far as I've seen, is a sense of duty about what we have within us, like what's our vocation and how it fits into a larger picture. So that's how I try to reconcile these divides, but I would really love to hear what other people have to say.
I guess, you know, I would react to this exchange by saying, you know, I guess I put the question back and ask, has there been real progress? And in our society, you know, since 1940, and in terms of race relations, as they used to call it, in terms of racial justice, race equality, are things better? And from my perspective, I was born in the Jim Crow era, but from my perspective, which is my perspective, the answer is yes, things have gotten better. And as things get better, we recognize the things that have not gotten better, and we recognize the ways in which justice has not been achieved. But if there's been progress, then that means it's possible for there to be progress. And I think it's very, very hard for the reasons that we've talked about in this particular domain, because there are so many people so deeply invested in the status quo. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, I think the fact that change has happened in other areas means change is possible.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that I try to think about on the meta level is what I'm doing advancing the values of freedom and liberation. And I think like on the day-to-day, maybe not. But in the big picture is what's my North Star? What's my guiding light? And I want to think it's not just equality or getting one person out of jail when those things are very important, but it's really like are we thinking about freedom and liberation? And I really like Professor Bell's call to be in community and coalition with a broad group of people. I mean, I straddle the divide of academic and deep practitioner, but I also work with doctors. I work with, you know, my law clinic that I run is embedded in a Veterans Affairs hospital campus of 300 acres. So I work with housing developers, I work with providers, and I think that that has given me such a more capacious view of how I can be a change agent for, you know, some of the most marginalized people I have ever represented, you know, unhoused Black veterans who are elderly. You know, I mean, this is a community that has been completely forgotten by, you know, almost every single mainstream movement. And yet here we are, you know.
And I just want to touch on the alternatives because, you know, a lot of times abolition is looked at as just a sledgehammer, you know, dismantling something. And look, I'm comfortable with that because that's my experience. To be honest with you, that's what I know. But I also do know too that there's a lot of good groups out there that are doing alternatives to police and prisons, right? Dream Defenders is one of them. So I would encourage people that are looking at these alternatives to calling the police and prisons, look at Dream Defenders, but also will say this, that every day in our communities, or Black and brown communities, abolition is playing out. I think there was a recent study that showed like 80% of victims don't call the police, right? There's a reason why people don't call the police is because we don't trust the police because of our experiences. Now, these abolitionist practices aren't getting funded, you know, and I think that there should be more resources going into communities to figure out how we deal with this intercommunal harm, right? This intercommunal violence. Because I know, like, in my case, when I went to prison, and many of us who went to prison for violence and murder, we had to resolve these problems with other neighborhoods or even people from our neighborhoods ourselves. The state didn't resolve that, the police didn't resolve it, the prison system certainly didn't resolve it. We resolved it on the yard. We resolved it in the cell. Our families resolved it over neighborhood reunions because harm, like you don't go out your neighborhood to harm someone. Even when you're gang warned, that's the hood right across the way that you used to play football with them dudes with basketball. And this isn't just Black people, this is human beings, period. You know what I'm saying? Human beings harm other people that look like them all over the world, right? And poor people harm other poor people at higher rates than people who have resources. You know, this is a fact. This is human history. This is human development. So investing in those alternatives and also going back to our traditions, because look, you know, we didn't call police. When you had to resolve something back in the day, and I'm going back, way back before me, you know, a lot of that was resolved in the church. A lot of that was resolved in community councils. A lot of that was resolved in our houses. But, you know, the war on drugs and mass incarceration has really severed those bonds that we once had in our communities. And I think that is the largest challenge for us as abolitionists is to, what's this called? Looking back to go forward. So I'm gonna look back, right, to go forward. Sankofa, absolutely. You know, that's what I did in prison, right? When we had to resolve beefs, and I'm talking about like your homie killed my homie, or I did something and took someone from you. Like I said, we had to go to our elders in those prisons, right? And sit down and say, okay, how you got to coexist, you know? And even on the street now, many of us, you know, are out here, and you know, it's not the best of the, you know, circumstances. We're not hugging each other, running up to each other, yo, what's up? But we were able to resolve, we were able to restore, and we were able to recognize that we caused irreparable harm to our communities, and that, you know, we owe a service to our communities. And the prison system didn't do that for none of us, you know what I'm saying? So that's what we have to invest in. But then that brings us to the other question. The system ain't gonna invest in that. And that's why we're gonna have to take those resources and we're gonna have to do what we can to get those. Or we're gonna have to do it like we've always been, self-reliant. So for me, alternatives, to answer your question, alternatives, the sledgehammer is the tip, right? The alternatives to abolition is everything that's underneath that, the tip of that iceberg, right? And that's the larger part of this process.
I don't think it's abolition or the alternatives. The way I see it is that's the way to abolition, is to expand upon the use of the churches, to expand upon the use of the elders in the community, to expand upon that as we go towards abolition.
Absolutely.
Because that is what abolition would look like.
Yeah, totally. It's not just the sledgehammer.
I had a. Okay.
Progress.
I think there's
I'm sorry.
some point of order.
Do we have a microphone in back?
I have a microphone.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to agree and kind of draw out the major reason why and a possible follow-up on that, because one of the critiques of the abolitionist movement is, if you defund the police, it'd just be lawlessness, right? And so what has happened is in communities like where I live now in Baltimore, you have neighborhoods, right? Like Little Italy, and we got Jewish Town, like near Ricetown where the church is, that have their own kind of like defense teams, right? Where they patrol the streets. Little Mexico, I mean, everybody has like an apparatus where they don't have to call the police because it takes forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want somebody to get shot or go to jail, but they have their own defense. I like what you said because it was the first time that there was an alternative that did not include another violent apparatus, right? You mentioned like going to the elders in prison, because a lot of folks don't call the police. The mafia doesn't call the police either. They work their stuff out internally as well. So I think that more of those type of solutions, and I'm happy you said it because I didn't know about that other alternative. I think more of those things, and utilizing community-based resources like the faith community. I'll never forget when some rappers got into it in the 90s. I think Farrakhan called a meeting between both of them and squashed the beef, right? And I think more of those type of solutions will be more plausible. It's still gonna be a fight, but did not know your stance on communities kind of defending themselves, which I'm not really mad at. I'm not mad at Little Italy, because to me, the Black Panther Party did that. I tried to for us in California and other places across the country, Chicago and other places. But I just didn't know where you stood on that pendulum, or anybody, and if there's a pro or con for each one of them.
I could just be real quick. I support self-defense. The Deacons of Defense, the Black Panther Party, my mentors were members of the Black Liberation Army. I'm pro self-defense. Hell, I'm pro Second Amendment, even though I can't own a firearm. Shit, that if you ask me what's the collateral consequences of my incarceration that I feel the most, is that I can't own a firearm, right? Legally own a firearm. But now the flip side of that is that, remember, those Little Italy is always it's gonna look like more of a surrogate of the police state, right? So there's dangers to it. Like everything, there's pros and cons, but if a community, wants to pool its resources and defend itself or secure itself, I don't want to say police itself because I don't even want to use the carceral language, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As long as it does not become oppressive and that the people who are doing it have the right intentions. If they're going to model themselves after the Deacons of Defense and the Black Panther Party, I'm all for it personally.
No, you go first. Go ahead, please.
Okay, this is just, a quick reaction. I'm so glad we're talking about alternatives in the last minute that we have. But I will say, I don't know that I'm for self-defense. And let me say a little bit more why. So I'm for certain forms of self-defense, but not necessarily armed self-defense. And this is because we live in a world where white communities and affluent communities are already using the police in these ways and also have their own private security. So there's this way in which, I think certain forms of alternative, so credible messengers is often like the language used to talk about, people doing conflict resolution and things like this, who are from, marginalized communities who have these direct experiences and therefore have certain types of legitimacy. I think that's really important. I think transformative justice organizations and healing circles and all of these things are super, super important and moving a lot of that out of the state. I think having private police, which is what we're talking about here, gets really dangerous in terms of accountability and the fact that we don't all just stay in our own neighborhoods. So.
I'm not going to weigh in on that. What I would say is I just wanted to, in addition to the alternatives, restorative justice kind of models, I think there's also, in the work I'm doing, looking at institutional spaces, thinking about what we can do to create a different built environment. And now built environment in urban planning is has been a useful tool for the carceral apparatus and for policing, but there's ways to think about it in a flip sense. So in hospital spaces or schools, healing gardens or sensory rooms, things that kind of create a space that's more healing and nurturing when you're in a stressful environment studies have shown, will reduce the triage nurse from calling the police so many times on people who are really in crisis or just, sick and need to see a doctor and don't know how to communicate that well. So I think there are ways we can also change the way our world looks to discourage the use of police.
Great. So as is clear, this is a conversation that needs to keep going, but it can't keep going now. So I will say this is my first in-person conference since. So we're over time. We I think need to wrap up just so we can get to the third panel. I will say again, so fortunate to be here with all of you. We're going to take 10 minutes now. We'll come back at 3:20 for our final panel, Bringing It Home: How Slavery Impacts Property and Land Ownership in Colorado Today. Thank you all so much for the wonderful questions. I'd love to keep the conversation going.